Okay. Sorry, it's preparing the. Okay, and I'm just going to post that link on our Facebook to say that we're live.
No bother at all.
Okay. All right. Okay, so welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum. Delighted that we're able to do some of these talks online, and I have to say it's thanks to the sponsorship of the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're using their Zoom account, so that's why the names are kind of different. I'm delighted to say tonight we have the first of two digital talks on history online, but also genealogy. Tomorrow night we'll be joined at 7 p.m. with the Irish American Heritage Museum's resident genealogist, who's also a member of New York Society of Genealogy, Lisa Walsh Doherty, and she's going to talk us through some of the online resources that you can access if you're tracing, your Irish roots. So we'll have that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. You can register for the Zoom or you can watch it live on YouTube, and these talks will be available afterwards too on our Facebook page. But tonight we have a very interesting talk, I think, with Davy Holden about technology and social media and all of that. We called it Digital History: The Past in the Future. And so Davy is an Irish history content creator based in County Kilkenny. He was always fascinated with history, even though he didn't actually officially study it, but began creating videos and things after COVID. So it's a passion project. He's absolutely obsessed with Irish history, and we'll talk about some of his favorite parts. He has almost, 500,000 followers. He has released books, traveled to the United States to perform Irish history workshops, and he's spoken at multiple universities and schools. His aim is really to make Irish history come alive through the lens of his camera, to preserve stories that have been passed down from our ancestors, but also to try to engage with new, potentially younger followers. And so we'll, talk about that. And as usual, those of you who are online with us, if you want to use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen, you can do so to ask him a question. But Davy, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. I know it's a little bit late there at home in Kilkenny.
No, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, me too. Well, so I talked a little bit about it there, but tell us how you got started in this. We were talking offline that it may have come, sort of through COVID. But
Yeah.
how familiar were you with, both the technological side of things and also then the history, of course?
Yeah. So I started out, I've always had an interest in Irish history since I was a kid. I think my dad was a big influence on me when I was small. I got my first Irish history book from my dad. It was My Fight for Irish Freedom by Dan Breen. And I remember reading that as a kid, and I just went down an absolute rabbit hole. I couldn't get enough Irish history books into me, and I absolutely loved it.
Mhm.
Studied it throughout my whole life pretty much. Outside of school as well, I was constantly reading books, just became obsessed with it. In 2020, um, I started to learn a little bit of videography, bit of camera work, post-production, how to create videos. And I fell in love with that, especially because it was during COVID years. You're kind of stuck in
Mhm.
a house, so using a camera and learning a new skill was fun. And
Mhm.
after developing a big passion for video production, I really wanted to start my own channel.
Mhm.
And I suppose I didn't have to put a huge amount of thought into what channel that would be. I mean, it was kind of like an amalgamation of my two favorite things. It was like my new skill now, which is like video production, and then Irish history. And I'd never really seen it online very much as well. So that was probably a big part of it. And I suppose that was the aim from the start of the channel. It was to make Irish history more accessible, I suppose, and a little bit more try and appeal to the younger people as well to get like an interest in it, because I've
Mhm.
gotten that quite a bit even already. Like people would say, like send me messages saying, I never really had an interest in Irish history in school, but now I'm seeing how interesting it is,
Mhm.
because it's just a
Mhm.
new way of teaching it, because not everyone likes to read. For example, I know plenty of people that love Irish history and are very passionate about it, but they're not big readers.
Mhm.
So if you're that kind of person, you have very limited choices. You have like documentaries and things like that, or maybe going on history tours. But if you're not a big reader, you're going to need visuals, right? Or audio at least. So
Yeah,
that was a
yeah,
big part of the channel, appealing to the people that were passionate about it, but probably weren't going to sit down and read a book.
yeah, yeah.
So that, yeah, yeah,
And I can say, as a former history teacher here at Fordham University in New York, but also at home in Ireland in secondary schools before I did my PhD, I think some students are kind of wary of history. And maybe, they had a bad experience with a teacher earlier, or they think it's a long list of dates or maps. Like I wasn't a big map girl, even though I know plenty of historians who are. And I think others too sort of miss the point of history. And I have to say, like, as a teacher, particularly at the university level, when you had in the American system, business majors, for instance, like that have to take a history course but feel they're not interested, trying to explain to them that the skills of a historian are to synthesize information, to try to determine whether an argument is persuasive or truthful. There's all issues around objectivity and subjectivity, and so the skills of a historian are actually really important in lots of areas of life, and particularly these days with so much misinformation and disinformation and AI
mm,
deep fakes and all of that. So to bring us into that, and I don't know how prepared you are to talk about this, but I just remembered, like, you know, how amazing it is to see. For me, like, I love looking at colorized photographs or colorized footage because it brings the past alive. And
yeah,
I think we tend to think that people in the 1900s, didn't smile, or everybody was poor and downtrodden. And actually, when you see sometimes the colorized photographs, you realize, they were very, very like us. But then the other side of that is these deep fakes, where now you have videos of, for instance, Nancy Pelosi giving a speech, and they make her look like she's drunk. And so
mm.
what are the dangers with, recreating these past videos, whether it is just kind of digitizing something or putting something to music, which is absolutely fine. But then, how will people know what's real and what's not real, or what's authentic, I guess?
Yeah, this is where I have to be very careful, I guess, right? Because when you're creating videos, obviously it's a very creative zone, and like
Mhm.
that's where most of this is coming from. So it's very easy to lean on the entertainment side of it,
Yeah,
but it's so important to not do that,
yeah.
because when you're struggling maybe for a little bit of creativity, like what will I make a video on today? And then the creative juices are flowing, and you're kind of thinking about how do I make the most entertaining or the best video, but like that's not important at all. Do you know what I mean? I
Mhm.
know you want the video to be entertaining, you want people to enjoy the experience, but you don't want to
Mhm.
go too mad into that whole realm, especially with history, because being a creative in history, they're a
Mhm.
funny mix,
Yeah, yeah,
because you don't want to be recreating anything, do you know what I mean? Or
yeah.
coming up with any mad ideas. But like misinformation, like, is a huge part of what I do. Like, I mean, the majority of my work is cross-checking. Like that's what
Okay.
I spend so much time every single day doing. So I'm
Mhm.
using at least five resources for everything. Like that would probably be nowhere even near it. In fact, I'm using
Okay.
books, I'm using online articles, I'm using online archives, I'm using witness statements, and I'm cross-checking everything. So that's where all the time is spent for me, like, because obviously it's a lot of pressure. When you're creating these things, you have to be 100% correct in what you're doing.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of cross-checking. But to be fair, like it's the best time ever to be doing this because we've so many resources,
Mhm.
like even I can reach out to, if I'm really stuck, I can reach out to an Irish historian that specializes in that period. For
Yeah.
example, if I was doing 1798 and I became stumped on something, I can reach out to Colm O'Rourke. And the
Yeah.
Irish historians are absolutely brilliant. They're so good. Like they're so helpful and so willing to help you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, that's where the majority of my work is. Like it's really taking books, taking articles, taking witness statements, and just putting them all together and cross-checking them. But it is
Mhm.
quite difficult. But at the same time, it's fun. It's a lot of work, but it doesn't feel like work, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So we can't show a video of yours just because it'll kind of mess with our YouTube thing when we try to put it up later on, even though we would have your permission. So, everyone needs to check your page. But Davy, talk us through, like one of the videos that you've made, we'll say like on the War of Independence. How do you pick your subject? How long are these little videos? Because sometimes, they have to be quite short for just like if it's a reel or Instagram, have limits on the time. So just talk us through, one of the videos that you've made and what it is and how you did it.
Yep. So this is a big part, I guess, of what I do is the visual aspect. So this is
Mm,
what changes the traditional ways of, say, reading a book. I'm actually bringing you to the place that I'm talking about. So, for
mhm,
example, if I made a video last year, say, on Kilmichael for the anniversary. So I'm going down to Kilmichael. I'm showing you the exact area that I'm talking about. I'm showing you the exact area that Tom Barry stood. I'm showing you all the different locations that the Irish Republican Army were stationed at in that area. And I think that's a huge part of the entertainment side of it. Not entertainment, it's
yeah,
also educational, but it's so nice to see that,
yeah,
because
yeah,
even if you're reading a book on Kilmichael, which is excellent, but it's so nice to be able to see these places, it just
yeah,
brings the story to life. As you were saying, when you see like the old videos of Dublin in 1915 or whatever it is, it just brings it to life.
hmm,
It's not so much a story anymore. You're kind of brought into it and you're like, oh, this is real. This actually happened right here. So that's a
hmm,
huge part of it. That's a massive part of my channel that I like to do. Like, it's very easy for me to create a video in my house about something that happened in West Cork, but
yeah,
it's just completely different when you actually travel down to West Cork, show people the areas, because that's a big part of it. Because a lot of people as well that are, watching my content and following me online are not in Ireland.
yeah,
A huge amount of diaspora, a lot of people in the United States, a lot of people in Canada, a lot of people in Australia. A lot of these people won't ever get to see these places, unfortunately.
hmm,
But yeah, so that's a massive part of what I do is definitely like traveling to places and showing you exactly where it happened. And that
okay,
is the biggest difference between obviously what I do compared to reading a book. But the videos on my platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and them, they're like 90-second videos. And
hmm,
this is one of the hardest parts about it because you have to crush such a big story into 90
yeah,
seconds. So you
yeah,
kind of have to choose what has to be in here and what can I leave out? People understand that this is not the entire story. This is like bite-sized history, basically. Now on
hmm,
YouTube, it's a little bit different.
hmm,
I can put a 15, 20-minute video, 30-minute video on YouTube. YouTube
hmm,
is definitely better, because you're just getting far more detail, like you
yeah,
would in a book. But
yeah, yeah.
Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, yeah, they're more bite-sized kind of overviews of
Yeah.
history.
And those are kind of the teasers, like if you're into this, come and learn the rest of the story, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I think
absolutely.
even all of the, museums and everything are utilizing social media at the moment, or, we've often said if I had the time in here, like I'd love to do a little quick, behind the scenes look at some of the treasures in the archives or that kind of thing, but it's to make them look nice as opposed to just me on my phone, which doesn't always come across very well. So when you then, let's talk about Kilmichael. So it was obviously the scene of a huge ambush that the IRA ambushed members of the Black and Tans. Was that the one where they killed all of the Black and Tans? Like maybe one escapes or,
Yes, so this
yeah,
was the auxiliary division of the Royal
yeah.
Irish Constabulary. Yeah, yeah. So they had been in Ireland since August that year, and
Mm-hmm.
Kilmichael was the 21st of November. So it was a few months after they arrived. They had never been engaged by the Republican forces, so that's why it's so significant, I suppose. That's the major significance of it. There was 18 of them in total. 16 were killed during the ambush. One was killed later that evening, and one, the driver of the second truck, got away.
Oh,
That was
okay.
really the huge significance of the Kilmichael ambush. Obviously, is because it was successful, but it was the timing of it as well. Because this is only a couple of weeks after Bloody Sunday as well. Like
Mm-hmm.
so it's of huge significance because of the timing.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
then Davy, I mean, in a minute, I might go into the technicalities of editing. So, like, you walk the space and you show them. Do you intersperse that then with like pictures, from the archives, sort of thing, and so it's a bit like a mini Burns documentary, kind of,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of work in the post-production video. Yeah,
Yeah,
because you're putting up pictures, say for Kilmichael now, for example, if I was there, I'd still pop up a video or a picture or video of Tom Barry, because Tom Barry
yeah.
actually has a very famous interview in Kilmichael from the 60s, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a lot of stuff, even popping up witness statements and stuff like that, or old pictures, old videos. Unfortunately, from that period, we don't have a huge amount of content. Well, we've a decent amount, but you're always struggling for
I know,
something.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
or to
yeah.
find a new kind of thing. And then how do you deal with Davy, the idea in one way of kind of bias or taking sides? Like it's very obvious kind of for an Irish person that, we would have oh, good on you guys, that was a good siege, unless you're, a total pacifist. But do you present that, or and particularly in that story too, like were you aware, and were the people at the time aware that maybe like they're bringing back down, hellfire on them, like there's definitely going to be retaliations, as Bloody Sunday had been a retaliation against the murder squad that morning, of the apostles.
Mhm.
So, how do you navigate that then as someone who's interpreting the events? Do you talk about what happens after Kilmichael?
Usually I'll do a lead up the
Okay.
majority of the time. Depends on the video. Sometimes you'll do a video on a particular topic and you'll show the aftermath. If you were doing
Mm-hmm.
1916, for example, you could show the aftermath. Be a very
Yeah.
kind of obvious one to do. With Kilmichael, for example, generally the opposite. I'd usually do the lead up because Kilmichael is so significant for the lead up,
Yeah.
not so much the aftermath. But that's one thing I do in a lot of my videos. Yeah, for example, I do a lot of videos that aren't actually based on a particular topic. I
Mm.
could cover a very broad, like not so much detailed version of, say, like the 1500s in Ireland to the early 1900s, these kind of things. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, no, that's very important. That's a huge thing I do on my channel is give you the lead up because if you're just telling people about the event
Yeah.
and
There's
they've
no.
never heard of it before, it kind of means very little.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like you don't know what's happened before, you don't know why it's happened, like what happened as a result. So that's a
Yeah.
massive part of it as well. And again, when you have 90 seconds to do this, it's quite difficult. So you kind of have to talk very fast. I've actually recently started subtitling my videos because a lot of people are saying to me, really enjoying the videos, but I've no idea what you're saying. You know?
Yeah, and as Irish people, we talk quickly anyway, but particularly when we're excited, and then when you have a time crunch.
Yeah.
So do you, Davy, have, like kind of favorites? Like you mentioned, Dan Breen, and of course he was famously anti-treaty after the War of Independence and into the Civil War. So, like, do you find, I will admit my bias. I absolutely agree with Michael Collins. I think Eamon de Valera was, a Scot.
Right,
And
right.
so when I'm, as a history teacher, I was very careful to try to be, objective and not take sides. And you got to present both sides, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, there's the whole debate about the treaty and whether they had the full powers or not. And the reality of the situation was that De Valera knew they weren't going to get any better. They had already had kind of negotiations in June where he failed to secure a republic. But
Mhm.
do you find yourself like sometimes having a sort of a favorite in the story, or agreeing with one side over the other and then trying to either not lean into that, or just acknowledging full on, like, I think this guy is an absolute hero, and I don't think the other side is correct at all.
Yeah, it's very easy to do, but I made a
Yeah.
rule to myself. I made a very strict set of rules for myself before I started the channel. I said I'm never giving bias or even my opinion, to be honest, in most
Oh,
cases. But I
yeah.
never give my bias. Now, obviously, I have my own opinions and stuff, but I just
Yeah.
completely leave them at home.
Oh,
But you can
okay.
probably maybe see, I wouldn't say bias, but you can probably see where I'm interested in. I'd
Yeah.
cover a lot in Tipperary. I cover a lot in Cork, I suppose, as well, those kind
Yeah.
of areas. But I suppose I can connect with them a lot more. Like I'm
Yeah.
from South Kilkenny. I'm from rural Ireland.
Mm.
So if I'm in South Tipperary, doesn't seem very different to me, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I
But I
kind of
think
connect
Cork
with
was
the
so
Irish.
important, during the
Yeah.
war things with the burnings and, yeah, yeah, a lot of action happening in Cork, and then later on when the assassination of Michael Collins too, it's a
Yeah.
complicated county. The
Yeah,
rebel.
yeah. So if I was from Dublin, I'd probably be leaning into Dublin's
Mhm.
history in the Irish War of Independence, or maybe 1916. So there's probably a
Mhm.
little bit of bias there. Again, I'm probably covering content that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I'm very aware that I do that. So I do, make
Try to branch
myself like,
out.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Because I noticed there even a couple of months ago, I think I did nothing but Irish War of Independence videos for like a month solid. And I was like, I need
Yeah.
to stop, need to
I know,
stop
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's easy, when you try to mark anniversaries, or when I started in the museum up in Albany, it was the decade of centenaries. So, because I started in 2018, and we literally did a talk a month on like what was happening in Ireland, kind of October 1919, November 1919. And in the end, I mean, all it is legacy of death and, different. And like some things were interesting because if there was maybe overtures of peace or the failure to get recognized at the Versailles, treaty, but you can kind of get stuck into maybe the details too, where like maybe one lecture every 3 months would have been enough, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
anniversary is a big part of my channel as well, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few channels actually doing that online where they'll post a picture and a bit of detail on this day, such and such happened. And I've started making videos around that as well. So every week I'll have a look at the following week or the following month and I'll see what's coming up and I'll make a
Yeah.
video based around that. So it's a nice way of doing it because people can kind of connect then because it's an anniversary, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a big part of my channel too, yeah, because sometimes you can run out of ideas. So it's
Yeah.
it's nice to be able to look at the anniversaries that are coming up and be able to cover them on the day.
And then, Davy, I mean, Tipperary is interesting because the history of the GAA there, of course, the Rock of Cashel and all that. Like, so there's religious aspects. I heard you mention earlier on, like the 1500s. Do you look at early kind of religious history or, the penal laws, those kinds of things?
A little bit, yeah. I've covered a little bit on the Reformation, for example, and the dissolution of religious houses and monasteries and that. Because again,
Mhm.
that's all local, you know.
Yeah.
This is massive, even like across the road. I live in a townland called Killahy, which
Mhm.
is Killacca Churchfield. So it's
Mhm.
straight across the road from my house is a little graveyard from the 1500s, and there's an
Mhm.
old church there, or the remains of a church, and like,
Mhm.
that dates back to the 1500s and was shut down during that period. So it's
Mhm.
just everywhere. Like this is a massive part of why I'm interested in it. You know, you can't get away from Irish history no matter where you live in Ireland. I
Yeah.
actually recently made a video where I took 5 mile radius from my house and I
Mhm.
said, let's see what we can find within 5 miles now. And I'm in the middle of nowhere, you
Mhm.
know, and you're just surrounded. Like, I mean, I've monuments for the Tide Wars in 1831,
Mhm.
few War of Independence ambush spots, a couple of RIC barracks that was captured. I have a dolmen half a mile from
Mhm.
my house,
Mhm.
6,000 year old dolmen, you know, and
Mhm.
then I've the church as well across the road. Like it's incredible. You're just
Yeah.
surrounded by it everywhere. And I'm like, I am from the middle of nowhere, like, do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah. What's your
rural South
nearest big
Kilkenny.
town? I'm trying to picture you.
What's that?
Where in the county are you? In Kilkenny?
Hoganstown.
Oh yeah, yeah, okay.
So I'd be 15 minutes from Waterford City.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's such a great, down there like Yarnir, Tipperary and Waterford and
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
Kilkenny.
actually a funny spot, yeah,
Okay.
because
Hmm.
within where I'm from now, I could be in New Ross, Wexford, Carrick-on-Suir, Tipperary, Waterford City within 15 minutes. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
you're
It's
right on the
incredible.
border of all
Yeah,
three.
yeah, yeah. And Davy, so my obsession, just from, as you say, like when you're looking around your own hometown and what's there, even though we have a castle that fell to Queen Elizabeth the first, the last castle in the Desmond Rebellion, an ancestor of mine defended it and was hanged in the courtyard. So we have that, but it was the famine for me was my, like I just could not separate myself from the Great Hunger. We have a mass grave there. How have you got a famine information from your county or local? And then what's your kind of absolute, one that you always go back to, just that's your own personal preference?
What period?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Or
So
some event, Mhm.
yeah, yeah. No, we've some famine memorials around me, even in Newmarket, which is in Hugginstown. We've Gardaí on Curta, which is the famine garden, just kind of a memorial for the people in the area. You also
Mhm.
have a famine museum in Kilkenny in McDonough Junction.
Okay.
You have a famine museum in there as well. But yeah, it's a period that I've obviously studied, but it wouldn't be my go-to as it would be yours. Yeah, like mine would be late 1800s, early 1900s. It's kind of mine, I suppose, is the revolutionary period, you know, the lead
Yeah.
up to it, home rule, the formation of the IRB, even back as like the Young Irelanders, that kind
Yeah.
of thing, you know. Then
Yeah.
leading up to 1916, Sinn Féin, War of Independence, Civil War, that kind of
Okay.
period. Yeah, most of the
Yeah.
revolutionary periods. Yeah, kind of starting mostly at I suppose 1848, Young Irelanders,
Okay,
and then
yeah,
into
yeah,
the Fenians. And I love going over like looking at the Fenian history in the United States with their
yeah,
invasions of Canada.
yeah,
In
yeah.
fact, that's one of the best books I've ever read by Christopher Klein.
Oh yeah,
Um, yeah,
he spoke for
brilliant.
us in my old job. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that is an
That is
excellent
it's
book.
a great book. Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize how tied Ireland and Irish Americans were, like right the way through, John Devoy and the
Yeah,
Catalpa and fundraising, and then all the way through the 1916 Rising, and of course De Valera coming here in 1920. Here in the society, we have a lot of archive, papers about particularly Cohen and the Friends of Irish Freedom and stuff. So it's interesting, we have Wolfe Tone's death mask upstairs too. So there's a lot of United Irishmen type stuff and some Parnell things.
yeah.
Lawrence has just asked, have you produced any videos that come closer to contemporary times?
Um, where I stop would
Mm,
be the Troubles in the North.
okay.
That's as far as I've went. Yeah, I've covered Bloody Sunday 1972 and a little bit on the 1981 hunger strike as well.
Yeah.
Hoping to do a lot more on the North. The reason I haven't done as much on the North is because I'm quite a distance away from there.
Geography. Yeah.
I like going places to actually shoot the videos rather than making them at home. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I haven't covered the North as much as I would love to. I
Mm-hmm.
will in the near future now. I'll have a lot more coming and the Troubles as well. Yeah, yeah,
And then,
definitely.
Davy, I hate to, sound politically correct or woke, but how is it, because you're young and because you're using like a new, we'll call it media, or a new style of teaching, how are you able to include voices that may have been sort of sidelined from mainstream history, like, LGBTQ, or even women, like we're, some of the women were sidelined for a long time, at the time by particularly De Valera, after we got independence, all of those women who were anti-treaty were kind of left
Mhm.
out in the cold and some of them imprisoned even. So how are you including, those voices and again, I know you're sort of focused on, we'll call it local history, but are there sources for you to mine for that kind of story?
Absolutely, yeah. And I still think, to be honest, to this day, the women of the revolution have not been covered enough at all.
Yeah,
Nowhere near, in fact.
yeah,
Like, I plan to do a lot more now, I'd say, on the Come the Man, because I actually have a lot of connections in Tipperary specifically to
mm,
Come the Man members. What friend of mine, for example, his great grandmother would have been a member of the Come the Man down
yeah,
there. She worked in a dispatch center, so she delivered messages to an IRA center that's there. And
yeah,
even 1916, leave alone the War of Independence, 1916, there's some incredible stories. Like Winifred Carney has
yeah,
like one of the most epic stories from the GPO. She walked in with James Connolly. She came in with was it like a Remington typewriter and a revolver in the other hand. Like she's just
yeah,
epic. There's some incredible stories. And sure, as
yeah,
you like, yourself, without the coming of man in the War of Independence, it would have been a total disaster. And
hmm,
they've done some incredible stuff in Dublin, like writing like having like lit stitching on the inside of their jackets with
yeah.
notes and carrying weapons. It was incredible. It still hasn't been covered enough though at all. And now I am not going to say that I've changed that at all. I still have to do a lot more on the women of the revolution for sure because it's nowhere near enough. Like, not at
No,
all.
well, and I think, I do think people are aware of it now, which is great, but I think I'm just looking for that famous picture. I'm hoping I can share my screen, and this is just to kind of bring technology to the forefront, like um the very famous, oh God, sorry, this is gonna annoy me. I thought I had a copy of the thing saved, but I want to just save it so that I can not show you everything. So look, for instance, at this. I'm going to share my screen. Hang on 1 second, sorry. So to talk about technology, so like the famous picture of Pierce, you
With
know,
Elizabeth O'Farrell.
exactly, like, and there he is doing the surrender, and she's right there because she had been the one that walked around the city and brought the letters to and from, and had to kind of contend with potentially being shot. And because of the way the camera worked, um, I'm just going to share the screen so people can see what I'm talking about. Uh,
I,
like
I,
this
I
is the
think I know
picture,
exactly what you're going to say.
of her.
Yeah.
Is everyone seeing the screen? Yeah, good. So, so for years the story was, poor Padraig Pearse, here he is, terribly shameful moment, he's given up his sword. And then eventually, because the photo looked a little bit, messy, they actually officially airbrushed her out of the
Yep.
record. So this is all we can see of the woman who technically was responsible, for negotiating the surrender, and so we've put her back in, which is great. But there have to be plenty of stories like that, I think, where, and even, honestly, David, and this is, I want to talk a little bit about this too. It's so interesting to me, again, like as a historian that taught this for years, like this idea, for instance, that, there was no violence against women during particularly the revolutionary period that you were interested in, or if
Mhm.
there was, we would ascribe it to the black and tans and the auxiliaries, but not to our own crowd. And now we're seeing, and of course, these things were recorded at the time and sometimes reported. And any of you who've looked at the military pensions files, which we'll talk about in a minute, like there are documented cases where women are raped or have their heads shaved, by both the British and the Irish if you were on the wrong side of the Civil War. So
Mhm.
I'm interested, and of course, like the societal burden of being a woman who was raped, like the best practice was to not talk about it at the
Yeah.
time, not to mind, and remember it now. But isn't it so interesting, like that, we're only now starting to kind of come to terms with that, which is, of course, a byproduct of every war in every history,
Yeah.
but there was something that we
100%. Yeah.
kind of ignored, yeah.
Yeah, but there's so much information just not out there yet, because even I say this all the time on my channel, like, because it's kind of funny, like Ireland has thousands of years of history, but yet the
Yeah,
country's so young.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
incredible. Like this stuff, like what I'm talking about, like it's 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's my great grandparents. My
Yeah,
parents grew up with people that lived through this or partook in it. You
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah,
It's absolutely nuts, like how young our country is in a way when you look at it that way.
yeah.
And
And it
there
is
is like,
because it's those memories. Like I think I've told the story before, but when I was starting to research the famine in my own hometown, it came because I was out for dinner with friends of my parents, So I was back from, I think I was living in Dubai at the time, and I was back for the summer. And one of the old guys, who was older than my parents even, I think I ordered crab, and he said, "Oh, we're not, we were never allowed to have that in the house. That's famine food." And I was like,
right.
Jeannie Mac, crab is kind of, like expensive and it's a delicacy and blah, blah, blah. And so it was just that kind of runaway comment, that made me think, God, so obviously we live near the coast, 9 miles from Ballygunion, people could access, periwinkles and crabs and maybe lobsters. Technically were forbidden to fish if the landlord owned the river, because people talk about that all the time, or they had pawned their boats. But there was alternative food sources, which then later generations absolutely rejected, And
Mhm.
so when I went then to further investigate, I was talking to the guy and he said, "What do you want to know that all misery for Garleen?" And it wouldn't tell me more stories, even though there's almost 5,000 people buried in my town from hunger and disease, And so I think the unwillingness of people to talk at the time, and then that kind of gets brought down a generation. So like if your grandmother remembers, her mother or father talking about stuff, but it was all kind of hush hush. So sometimes
Yeah.
it can be hard to tease out these stories too.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
So when you think about that, Davy, like I think some of these online archives, let's talk a little bit about that. Like the military pensions bureaus, and a lot of these are digitized now. So normal, amateur historians or genealogists, whoever they are, you don't have to be a member like of the library to look them up. But the military pensions archives are amazing for, the IRA, early IRA stuff.
Yeah.
Of course, the census data, a lot of that is online. And then some of the churches, the births and deaths and marriages are all
Hmm.
online. So how have you found utilizing those sources to tease out your stories?
Yeah, absolutely brilliant, incredible. What I use the most would be the O'Loughlin and Heron witness statements.
Mm.
They are fantastic. Yeah, they're phenomenal. I use them a lot of times in my videos, and you can even make videos about them alone, just reading
Yeah.
out a witness statement. It's phenomenal. Like I
Yeah.
use them a lot of the time for cross-checking. You can kind of jump into trouble with them sometimes because, like with any story, for example, if you're reading a witness statement of three people that were in a certain event, if you and three other people experience something, the story you tell is not going to be the exact same. Do you
Yeah.
know? Like it's going to be most of it is going to be like broadly it'll be the same, but there's going to be these like niche little parts of it. Maybe
Mm.
somebody mitigated a little bit of information, maybe
Yeah.
someone expressed a bit more. Maybe someone I wouldn't say exaggerated, but maybe possibly somebody exaggerated. And I find this all the time as well. Like, so that's the difficult side of it because you think when you have a witness statement, you're like, this is gospel, it's coming
Yeah,
from the horse's mouth. But
yeah.
no, they are fantastic. They help me so much in my work. I was even looking at one today, for example, based on a jailbreak in Care in County Tipperary. They're incredible to have. Yeah, yeah.
And so tell us where people can find, for instance, those archives that you're on about. Like, is it the military.ie or something?
It's Óglaich na hÉireann website, and
Mm-hmm.
they're down as witness statements. So if you
Okay,
type
yeah.
in, if you Google witness statements Óglaich na hÉireann, you'll get them, and they are incredible.
So Oglach is Oglach, I think.
O fada G L A I
G-H.
G H. Yeah,
Yeah, plural. Okay. So Oglaigh,
yeah,
Naharan, Ireland.
yeah.
Yeah.
Witness statements.
Um,
They're phenomenal, phenomenal.
yeah. And I
Yeah,
think, that it gives us such insight too into the different jobs. Again, to bring up kind of the women, women did carry messages or hid, the guns, fed people. We just had a guy give a lecture last week here about the time the IRA followed a man from Cork over to Central Park to kill him.
I covered this recently. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, Cruxy O'Connor.
Cruxy
And one of
O'Connor.
the women attempted to poison the men in the barracks, first. And so
Yeah,
very interesting kind of
yeah.
stuff,
I
yeah.
covered this last month actually because the anniversary was in April.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
covered that story. Yeah, it's a phenomenal story. I only came
Absolutely.
across that for the first time about a year ago.
Mm.
Never heard of it before.
Yeah,
No,
no, and
it's
neither had I. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
No, it's
And
incredible.
it's
Yeah,
interesting when our civil war spills over, like, and there's, shooting on the streets of Manhattan because of a Cork feud, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And that was one story now that I got a lot of shocked comments. Like people never heard of it before, you
No,
know?
yeah,
People
yeah,
from the States and people from Ireland never heard that
yeah.
story before.
And I think that's what makes history come alive, to be honest, for me, more that, and again, I absolutely adore history, like I was a teacher and stayed in school way longer than I needed to as a student, but it was always those kind of little nuggets of personal stories. Of course, like it's when you talk about the statistics or, the population before the famine and after the famine, like those kind of broad brushstrokes. But then when you can, somebody like Asenath Nicholson, who writes in her diary about, seeing the Irish when she's traveling around during the Great Hunger, or like, some individual story, I think makes the story so much more powerful than just like the kind of statistics of whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah. And you
Hmm.
can definitely do that. Like appealing to a lot of people like that, I suppose. So it's a little bit more personal. I think the Irish language is great for that as well. Do you know, like
Hmm.
what I've done recently is I've done a couple of videos on the anglicization of n place names in
Yeah,
Ireland, Loganamnica.
yeah,
So, for example, like Kilkenny, Kilquinnig, Church of Canis. Like there's so much history behind the Irish names. The anglicized versions have obviously kind of lost the meaning a lot. But I've done
absolutely.
videos on this as well. Like, look up your townsland, where you're from,
Yeah,
or your
yeah,
county, or village, whatever, and
yeah,
translate it from Irish into English.
yeah.
Just you're losing so much history there with that.
I
Like
think
if you
all they're
don't
doing
know.
is giving you the sound of the Irish word. They're not the meaning of the Irish word. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had a couple of talks on that. So tell me as well, Davy, about the genealogy aspect. Do people comment on your videos all the time, like wanting to know if there's more, history of particular families? I have to say, like a lot of Irish Americans, um, very interested in their history, but there's kind of gaps sometimes in the knowledge because maybe because of record keeping. So a lot of Irish Americans think that their people came from Cork, but that's just
Mhm.
because the boat left from Cork. They might have travelled from Wexford to get on that boat, or. So do you have those kinds of questions from people sometimes?
Yeah, I get them a lot. Yeah. Especially when I'm doing a video, say for example, that features say an O'Connor, for example, and then an O'Connor will contact me and say, like, whereabouts is he from and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And do you know any
yeah.
O'Connors from this area? Yeah. No, I get that a lot, yeah. And that's a very, very difficult. I don't go
It
into
is.
that side of it too much because it's incredibly difficult,
Yeah,
to if you don't have enough information, you're kind of nearly at a loose end sometimes. It's not
yeah, yeah,
impossible by any means, But yeah, it is quite difficult to nail it down. And
Yeah.
to be honest with you, I'm doing my own genealogy. I'm tracing
Right.
back my own family tree at the minute, like, so
Oh, good.
it is
How far
tough.
back
Like,
can you go? Or
and right now I'm at great grandparents, or sorry, I'm at great great grandparents.
okay, yeah.
So
And
I'm
like
gonna,
something that your father or mother had, like did they know a lot of the generations
yeah,
or
I mean, like without them, I would have been in trouble. But I'm using
yeah.
the census online quite a bit as well. So I'm
Mhm.
going to try and trace it back another generation. It's going to be tricky now
You
because
know.
there's a lot of Holdens in South Kilkenny,
Well, I was
and
going to ask you about the name actually. Like, is it Norman or a
Holden
bastardized
would
Irish name or,
Holden would originally be English.
yeah.
Yeah, it
Okay.
came to Ireland roughly 1500s, 1600s, but
Okay, yeah.
originally an English name. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then, to be honest, all of the rest of say my mother's maiden name, everything else is Irish. Holden is the
Yeah,
only kind of odd
I
one out
know.
in it. Yeah,
That's what I'm stack. It's the same where Normans, came in the 1200s with Strongbow. But
yeah.
everybody is a Mulvihill or a Clancy. Well, actually, my grandmother, which we just found out recently, my grandmother's maiden name is Grist, and she was one of three kids in Dublin. Her father he had a couple of siblings, so it was her grandfather had come, into the country, which we never knew, until very recently. My granduncle did this genealogy. So it turns out my great, whatever he was, grandfather was Welsh and his name was Ford. But he enlisted in the British Army the day his best friend John Grist died. And he took
Okay.
the name Grist so that he could, if he didn't like the army, he could, defect and not be traced. He would go back to being Ford. And as it happened, he was posted to Ireland in one of the few times that was peaceful. He was over in Galway and had a great time, fell in love with an Irish girl. So he had to stay grist. So, but you see, this goes to those inaccuracies. Like, how is it possible to come to a country, with not your real name? And so, this idea like of paperwork and passports and identification, and that's what a lot of, I think, Irish Americans run into too. There's a very famous story, oh, they changed our name at Ellis Island. And no names were changed at Ellis Island because Ellis Island does not record names. So like
Okay.
they're given the ship's manifesto and they tick off, Davy Holden, check, Elizabeth Stack, check. So you either misspelt your name yourself at the other side, when you booked your ticket, or later in New York, you changed your name to, be either more anglicized or to get, if you were Italian, maybe you were trying to get into an Irish job, so you dropped the Italian name, but it doesn't happen at Ellis Island, and so these myths that make it impossible then to trace back, your actual origins are very
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah. And then like a lot of the names, a lot of like O surnames, the O would have been
Yeah,
dropped or the Mac would have been dropped as well. I'm
yeah,
not
or they
far
add
from
them,
the,
which
what's
is
that?
hilarious, or they add them,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, because I'm not
Mhm.
too far from the Dunbrody. The Dunbrody famine ship.
The
It's in New
famine ship,
Ross.
yeah.
I'm only 15 minutes away from that area, So
Mm.
even a lot of from, I went down there recently enough and done a video down there, and like surnames were changed, or even first names were changed so
Yeah,
often. Like it's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah.
It's so
And I,
sad as well,
it's
because the O
so
or the
sad.
Mac is such an important part of that surname.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say too, what you often see in the census figures, like the same names being repeated, even within a family. And so, maybe the baby died and you're going to reuse the name Patrick, 3 years later. So sometimes that's kind of difficult that I mean, I do think it's important for particularly amateur historians. And like, I am by no means a genealogist and wouldn't even know really how to start it. Because I think it's a very niche skill, and you're very
Yeah.
tempted to say, oh, that Mike Kelly is my Mike Kelly, but it mightn't be, so you gotta, like, it is real detective work, but there's also like a sort of a science to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so tricky. Like, even for me now, I'm from South Kilkenny, right? I'm Holden.
Mhm.
I'm related to about 40% of the Holdens in South Kilkenny, I'd say. Like there's
Yeah.
so many. There's so many.
Yeah.
This is a tiny little parish in County Kilkenny, and there's
Yeah.
loads of Holdens I'm not even related to.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
maybe, of course, if you went back maybe, wow, I'd say about 4 or 5 generations, potentially, I
Yeah.
suppose, yeah. But
Yeah.
it is wild. You can have this even in a tiny little parish in Ireland.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, and we're
it's
the
such
same.
a
The
different.
Stacks, everyone like Stack is a really popular Kerry name. There are lots of Stacks in my hometown, Listowel, and I'm not related to half of them. Like my father was one of two. His father was one of five, but only two of them had kids. So and back that generation, the generation back immigrated. So, maybe another generation or two back, but we don't have, like, the other stacks in the town are not related to us, unless it is
Yeah,
going back 200 years or something.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so the census information, tell us, Davy, how, or maybe you don't know, but like, how does that change from decade to decade? Like, are there some decades that are way more interesting, or they ask for different information? I know the American census changes, bit by bit over time, and sometimes they ask if you're an immigrant or not. Are our census just like who's in the house and are you literate or not? What's going on with our census?
Yeah, so on our census, you'll have all of the names, you'll have ages, you'll have occupation, and you'll have literate or not. And
Mhm.
that is there anything else on it? No, that's as much detail. And the townland that you're from. That's as
Mhm.
much detail as it goes into. Yeah, yeah. And it'll show you like son, daughter,
Yeah,
wife,
the
father,
relationships.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But no, they're in fairness now, they are very good. Like they
Yeah.
are very good. Yeah, they're brilliant. Now, the only unfortunate thing about the Irish census is we're missing so much. There's
Yeah.
massive gaps, like where you have nothing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can kind of maybe do. It's probably easy for someone my age to do, say, great grandparents. Not too
Hmm.
bad at all.
Hmm.
Great grandparents, bit of a nightmare.
Yeah.
This the information isn't really there. So that's the biggest
And
problem. The
so
information that's recorded is brilliant.
now say that again. So like, is stuff from the 1850s, we'll say, recorded and not digitized? Or, I know of course the forecourts were burnt and the libraries and stuff. And they're doing a great job. We did a talk last year or the year before, and the Irish American Heritage Museum, it'll be on our YouTube channel, about the reconstruction of those archives, which is amazing. The fact that they've been able to kind of digitally replace a lot of the information. But is that what's happening? Like, they didn't digitize them, or they didn't exist?
Didn't ex Well, they
It was that
partially
long.
exist. Yeah,
Yeah.
so the mid 1800s, they are there. They are digitized, but there's very little information there. For example, none of my family history is there at all.
Wow.
It's yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there is information there, yeah, but it's just very, very limited, unfortunately. A lot
Okay.
of it was lost or destroyed. So,
Yeah. And this is
yeah,
down to individual kind of, your local church might have burnt down or flooded, or, whatever it was, or the census is different, obviously, but there are
yeah,
reasons why these local, things have pockets of emptiness. Yeah.
yeah. It's a pity because, as we all know, I suppose the mid 1800s is the one you'd
I
really want,
know.
like, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
It's probably the
absolutely.
most important one of all.
Yeah. And like, we must have those statistics, because we all kind of grew up with the famous statistic in 1841, there was 8 million, in
Mhm.
1851, there was only however many million. So we kind of have the broad brush strokes, but we mustn't have the individual returns, I guess, for
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
just, yeah. Hmm.
Population was nearly cut in half there in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
space of a
And like, we're
decade,
still
really.
not back up to the pre-famine level, which is, I mean, we're getting there, thank God, but it's taking its time. Yeah.
Yeah,
My,
yeah, it was 8 million, say, 1841, yeah. And now what Ireland, the whole island is 7 million. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. What about, Davy, just to kind of go back off of Lawrence's question, and I don't know if anyone else has questions, please do type them in. Um, what about things like the Magdalen laundries, and, where it might be difficult for historians to get involved, because of the censorship and the records being hidden. Like, I know we have those 3 reports, which
Mhm.
are massively exhaustive. Like, I don't know if anyone has read them. And maybe you haven't like looked into this as, a topic yet, but how do you see those kinds of, huge topics that there potentially is a ton of paperwork generated by, and yet we might not ever have access to it?
And topics that are maybe a little bit controversial, I suppose, with
Yeah,
differing opinions.
yeah.
Very difficult to cover. Very difficult. Now, that's not an excuse to not do it either. Like I'd even get that a
Good
little bit
reason
with
though.
covering. I'd get that even a little bit myself with the Troubles, because it's so
Yeah,
recent.
yeah,
It is history, of course, but at the same time, there's a
yeah,
lot of people that partook in that still alive. So you're kind of it's strange to tell someone's story
yeah,
on behalf of them when they could tell it
yeah,
themselves.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a
And
very
especially
I've
in a post-Good Friday agreement, like, we have to be tricky diplomatically, kind of. Almost every time that we've done a talk on the north of Ireland, it's so funny. So even to say that, like, is it the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, and people weigh in, and I will say, as a historian, which may be wrong of me to say, I try not to get hung up like on the semantics of things, you know, like I'm very, so Derry, London Derry, I
Mm.
will probably always say Derry, for instance, you know,
Yeah,
without trying to generate controversy or reveal a bias, you know. But I do sometimes think like we get pushback on the weirdest of things sometimes, and you just think, wow, like that's A, I didn't mean it that way, or B, I don't think people in Ireland would call it that or worry about that, or people in the South would, you know. So it is kind of a minefield, I think, diplomatically sometimes talking about some of these topics.
it is. Yeah, I have to be very careful on my channel now. Naturally, I would say Derry as well, like without
Yeah.
any. It's just what I
Hesitation,
would
like,
say.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But now, but it is very difficult. I think if I said Londonderry on my channel, I
Oh
wouldn't
yeah,
be long
people would
hearing about it.
assume a
Like,
certain, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I suppose, yeah, I suppose. But it's very
And
mixed as well. But people are
yeah,
still very strong about that. And I, for one, as well, would always say the north of Ireland, which isn't technically on paper what you should say, I guess. You know what I mean?
yeah,
But I'd still always say that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And if
And
I didn't, I'd hear about it. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was going to say in terms of the hunger strikers, you know, um, particularly because that's become such a hot potato recently, like with the legislation, you know, the Legacy Act and all of that. Um, how do you think that's going to affect if you do continue to make that kind of content? So for instance, I read an article in the paper a week or two ago, you know, that because of this act, they may be not doing any more inquiries into like, you know, kind of fatalities of civilians or potentially government backed, you know, disasters. And yet at the same time, they're wanting an open public history, they're calling it, of the
yeah,
Troubles. So they've appointed a panel of historians to kind of oversee information that they're not going to make available to lawyers or families, but they are somehow going to make it available to historians, which on the one hand, part of me thinks great because it'll go into the public domain and at least we'll have access to it instead of it being locked away for 50 years. But it's kind of tricky, isn't it? Like politically, I think for Ireland, the whole island of Ireland right now,
mm,
because of the post-Brexit, you know, thing and unification possibly happening in let's say our lifetimes, but maybe not.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
a question in there somewhere and I forget what it was. Like, how do you think that's going to affect how you make videos of those?
Yeah, because of the recent periods. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I'm even nervous making them, to be honest, because it's weird for me. Do you know, for example, last summer I met a man that was in jail cell with Bobby Sands. And
Wow.
when I was chatting to him, it was incredible to meet him. But at the same time, I was like, I've made a video about, not about you specifically, obviously, but I was
Yeah.
thinking in my head, like, I've made videos on this and now I'm sitting beside a lad that was there. It
Yeah.
feels weird, And
I
I kind of
know.
had that for a while. I was like, maybe I'm not the guy to do this. Maybe
Yeah.
this should be done by somebody up there that's lived through it, experienced it. Kind of have a bit of imposter syndrome a little bit when I'm doing it. It's just strange making videos about people that are, you could have somebody watching my video that was there,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a really, really dodgy, I suppose, because I'm just one person, I'm not an organization. I can't get
Mm-hmm.
loads of people's opinions on what I should do. It's just me. So I do
Yeah.
have to be very, very careful. And I am very careful anyways. I don't think I'll ever do anything wrong like Jack and Way. Like everything that I do is like researched and thought about a lot
Yeah.
before it's posted. But it
Yeah.
is, yeah, like these recent times, I suppose, when there's controversy around it, even still,
Mm-hmm.
it's incredibly difficult. Yeah, yeah.
Well, and I mean, you know, the hunger strikes are 40 years ago, so
Mm,
I suppose that, you know, you can't come too much closer because it is so far away, you know, or I mean, it's not history, it's kind of current affairs. But I think too, you know, you're trying to tell the story and maybe raise awareness. And a week or two ago, we had a colloquium with Queen's University and the Lyric Theatre, and they were talking about, you know, telling stories and when communities are ready to share, but also ready to hear the story, and like about gatekeeping and stuff. So I think, you know, part of me thinks you're right to tell the story and ignore your imposter syndrome because, like, let's say the facts, you know, objectively are there to be interpreted and to be looked at and shared. And so if you were not trying to do any more than that, I
yeah.
think it's legitimate, you know, to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Lawrence Good is coming up with technical questions, which would be great. I think he hasn't typed them yet, but here they're coming. Uh,
Perfect.
how long does it take for you to make, for instance, a 15-minute video, and what software do you use? Excellent. This is all going to go
I,
over my head.
they're all different, right? But
Yeah.
I made one video a few months ago, 90 seconds long, minute and a half, that
Yeah.
took like 8, 9 hours. And this is
Mm,
just that was just the editing part. That wasn't the research. So,
okay.
talking maybe a week. They're not all like that. If I'm making a video on a topic that I'm already knowledgeable on, it's a lot quicker.
Yeah.
But yeah, like
And so that editing is excessive because it has to fit into the real, type
yeah,
format. Yeah.
yeah. I can
Okay.
spend 2 hours making a 90-second video. I can spend an entire day making one. But
Mhm.
I would say at least 2 hours. It'd be very rare I'd make a video quicker than that. So to answer your question about the 15-minute video, it actually depends. Sometimes a longer form video is way
Will
quicker to
require
make.
less editing. Yeah.
Yeah, way less editing. You're not trying to squash things down and like
Mhm.
think of like what do I need to put in here? What can I take out if I have to? So usually the longer form videos are actually much easier, to be honest,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
there's just nowhere near as much editing. Now, there's a lot of research in them, of course,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, longer form video usually I'd go out and shoot for a day and they don't take long to edit. They could take a couple of hours maybe.
And
And I
David, do you
use
storyboard them first? Like, do you know what you're trying to do, before you record? So you have your script written, sort of a thing for the voiceover and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, most of the
Okay.
time. Yeah. So a
Mhm,
lot of the time what I'll do is I'll go out, what I've done recently is I've went out with Irish historians and we'll
mhm,
cover a particular topic. So last week I met Colm O'Rourke. We went around Wicklow and Carlow. I'd done a bit of 1798 history.
mhm,
Um, Back a couple of months I met Tom Hennessy in Tipperary. We did a bit of South Tipperary War of Independence history. But
mhm.
if I'm going out on my own, they'll mostly be scripted. Yeah, with a
Okay.
bit of kind of natural talking in there as well for sure. But I'll have
Yeah.
a script so I don't forget and leave out information or anything.
Okay.
And software wise, I use DaVinci Resolve. That's what I
Oh.
edit everything on. Yeah, which is a free software, funnily enough,
Oh,
even though
great.
it's
Yeah.
it's kind of mad that it's free because it's so good. But yeah, DaVinci
Oh, well,
Resolve,
that's
that's
good
the
to know.
one.
Da Vinci. Okay.
Mm, yeah, it's
Okay.
brilliant.
One more. Siobhan says, don't we have to tell history for the times, for the world also that we want to create? So, for example, a united Ireland, considering the Catholic and Protestant sides.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't
100%.
think anyone is disputing that. But obviously, so like when you did for instance, a story about the hunger strikers, I mean, that doesn't look well from the British perspective, you know what I mean? But are you including like Margaret Thatcher's, political kind of ideology, or or are you just telling the story of the hunger strike from their
Usually,
perspective?
as much as I possibly can, I'll bring in both sides. I try and do
Mhm,
that all the time. Like if you look at my channel, for example, I have a lot of interviews of like British soldiers and stuff, telling their story.
mhm,
And
mhm.
a lot of the time they're really sad to watch, to be honest.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, no, I'll do that. I do that a lot. Yeah, I'll bring in both sides. But that's one thing I always try and do because that's where like misinformation can kind of come in as well. Like for
yeah,
example, if you have a particular event and you have two different stories, slightly differing, a lot of the
yeah,
time what I'll do is I'll give both stories.
yeah,
I'd
yeah,
say some people said this is what happened, some people believe this is what happened according to different witness statements. But
yeah.
yeah, no, I love giving opinions on both sides. Like I've done so many interviews with British soldiers from War of Independence and from 1916,
Mm.
and they're so important to watch. Like because I
Mhm.
suppose if you're watching nothing but like Irish videos, you can
Yeah,
kind of maybe easily be a bit biased and take a side. You know what I mean?
yeah,
But then you
yeah,
watch a video of someone on the other side, and
yeah.
they're a person. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I was just going to say there are people, and like the whole, we, particularly maybe my generation or the generation before me, were, there was a lot of falsehoods told about the black and tans, that they released everybody from prison and blah blah. And it turns out actually some of them were demobilized soldiers from World War I, often with PTSD, and so it's not like they released cutthroat murderers from prisons and handed them a gun. Like they were sometimes military maybe
Yeah,
this was more the auxiliaries and the black and tans, but that was like the myth, that they had descended on us as a murder gang, as opposed to, and it's the same thing when you talk to soldiers from, the streets of Belfast in the 70s and 80s, young 18, 19 year olds who had been told these people hate you, and like just kind of the pressure and the fear that they're living under, Yeah. But and
Yeah.
I think that's what, history obviously is about, telling the story. I don't think or most historians, I mean, I do think some historians are biased, absolutely, depending on the subject. But they usually make clear that they are biased. Like, I'm writing a
Yeah.
Republican history or a whatever it is version of history, and so they would usually nail their colors to the mast, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
in those kinds
100%.
of topics. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's so many stories from when, say, like some of the British forces helped out Irish people that you never
Mm.
hear.
Yeah,
You'd
yeah,
never hear them really,
yeah.
and they're very interesting.
Yeah, or even, the girls dating British soldiers,
Yeah,
or the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were Irish, sometimes Irish speaking, a lot of them Catholic, and,
yeah,
so like, we tar the RIC, as being almost a foreign power, and they're not. Like, they were our own crowd, as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely, yeah.
I
And
think
then
that's,
the whole
you're
fact that,
humanizing the story.
yeah, and the fact that there was so many Irishmen in the British forces as well, so many.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Should I say that like there's different historians have different percentages on this? I think the most accurate one I've seen is probably, I think it was Jim Hurley. He wrote a book on it. But the Black and Tans, like about 10% of those were Irish.
Yeah, yeah.
Some
Which
people
is,
say 20%, some people say 5%, but it
yeah.
seems to be the most
But
kind of accurate
did even
representation.
have any of them, in one way.
Yeah,
So Siobhan said she wasn't saying that you were biased, just that she thinks it's interesting how, uh, the history of how history is told and why is interesting.
yeah,
Absolutely, and so that's, I do think, as more and more resources become available online, and as, so that's, we're talking earlier about the women and maybe LGBTQ voices, like, the circle is widening, because we're seeing that there are more to the story than just great men, or whatever it is,
yeah,
which I think can only be a good thing. And I
absolutely,
also
yeah,
think, maybe, the focus for somebody like you to focus on local history as well is so important, because we do tend to, only talk about Cork City or Dublin City, and, particularly for events, I think, like the Great Hunger, but even, there's lots of different podcasts. There was, people killed, during the War of Independence in my hometown, and, the descendants of both sides are still there. And, Connor Keane did a podcast a year or two ago about it, and, like, it's absolutely fascinating to hear the descendants still, kind of living with it, and just the motives at the time, and why these things happen. So I think, yeah, a small town can shed a huge light on a topic.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
100%, yeah. Yeah, that's one thing I do on my channel quite a bit. A lot of the time, I don't think people probably realize, but a lot of the time when I'm out and about walking around, I'm actually like just in the townland that I'm from.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Jake,
I'm
that
keeping it a lot more
will
local
walk
than
in
people might
more.
think. Yeah.
So, JP, tell us the name of your YouTube channel, and, we'll follow you on Instagram and Twitter, and we already do here at the Society. But, yeah, so tell us
Grand.
your YouTube channel.
My channel, same name on all channels. It's just Davy Holden, just my name.
Davy Holden. Okay,
That's
good.
it.
Well,
Yeah.
look, thank you so much. We went a little bit later than I thought, but this was absolutely fascinating. They're loving it. Lauren said thank you very much too. And, keep an eye, Davy. You'll have to visit New York and come over and see the
W
archives here.
Would you believe I'm planning on moving to New York in August?
Get out. Oh, wow. Good
Yeah.
luck. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, keep
So,
in touch.
yeah, I will do. I
All
will do.
right, great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Don't forget, we're back tomorrow at 7 o'clock instead of 6, because Davy's over in Kilkenny, so it's 5 hours later. So tomorrow at 7 o'clock with Lisa, to talk about your, finding online sources to track your Irish genealogy. So, good night, everyone. Thanks very much, and take care, Davy. I'll talk to you soon.
Elizabeth, thanks so much. And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. That's great.
October,
Brilliant.
delighted. Take care. Good night.